record before we start. So it's coming up on here. Oh, yay! Awesome, great. Well, the way I think we'll get this to work is that we will have one presenter give their paper and then do their question time, and then we won't save them all for last. I think we'll do them one after the other. So our first presenter is Eleri Lynn. And is Anne joining you?
No, she's not.
Okay, so we have Eleri giving a paper and on a stitch in time, the Royal School of Needlework and Recreated Stitch. So without further ado,
Thank you very much.
Great, thank you. Hi everybody, good morning. So a huge thank you for having me come and speak today. My name is Eleri Lynn and I'm a fashion curator and historian and a trustee at the Royal School of Needlework. You'll notice that I am here on my own, not with Anne Butcher, as listed in the programme. So Anne is the head of studio and is very busy, engaged, heading up the studio today. But the RSN is very well represented. Isabella and Marg from the RSN are giving the parallel talk to this one, so perhaps a little bit overkill to have too many of us. But moving on, a major focus of my work as a curator has involved the care, the research and the acquisition of items of historic dress and textiles into the collections in my care, both at the V&A and at historic royal palaces. Both collections offer a different focus and collecting criteria, so that's design excellence at the V&A, and at historic royal palaces that would be collecting objects that relate to the palaces and the people who live there. So, of course, a major focus and factor in acquiring and then displaying historic objects is the research and interrogation of said objects, representative of the fashions and culture of their time and imbued with meaning and significance for the people who made them and used them, and indeed for us, trying to decipher that meaning in the years or centuries to follow. Now, one of the objects it was my great pleasure to encounter as curator of the Royal Ceremonial Dress Collection was the Bacton altar cloth. The cloth has been the subject of my research since I first came across it in 2015, so quite a while now. And it's been the subject of my research and papers and a few conference papers, and 1,000 hours of conservation research that culminated in the exhibition, The Lost Dress of Elizabeth I, where I contextualised the cloth alongside loans from the British Museum, V&A, British Library and Hatfield House. And the cloth remains a subject of research for myself and others now too, including for the Bacton Altar Cloth Stitch Group, members of whom are represented here today, and Cynthia, who's leading a workshop this afternoon. So what I hope to do with you this morning is to explore the triangulation of expertise that has provided invaluable information about the cloth, and that's namely the triangulation of collaboration of curation, conservation and recreative practice. So extant material culture in the form of surviving textiles and dress from this period is incredibly rare, and particularly extant examples with elite or court provenance. And so the opportunity to investigate tangible objects with all their complexity and problems and all the consequent information that can be gleaned is very rare. So this serves as a great case study into interpreting historic textiles and dress through interdisciplinary fields and what recreative practice can bring to the table. But before I do that, I'm going to give a quick summary of the background story for those that might not know it. So the Bacton altar cloth is seen here. It's a T-shaped altar cloth from the Church of St Faith's in Bacton, Herefordshire. Now, I first came across it in spring 2015 when I was researching my book Tudor Fashion, and I saw this photo online, and I thought to myself, well, that looks very 1590s, and I went to go and have a look at it with my colleague Emma Henney from the conservation team at Hampton Court. I immediately thought it looked very beautiful, very rare. Stylistically, it's late Elizabethan, but here too was gold and silver thread, silk woven in with the silk, silver woven in with the silk, and the quality of professional embroidery that I hadn't seen in years of invigilating research appointments at the V&A. It was also clear from the way it was put together that it had not been made as an altar cloth. It had been something else before. And the what of that is what I'd like to come back to in a bit. But what made it particularly tantalising was that Bacton was the birthplace and intended burial place of one Blanche Parry, lifelong companion to Elizabeth I, and the recipient of many gifts, including clothing from the wardrobe of the Virgin Queen herself. So I asked to borrow it and took it back to Hampton Court for research and conservation, which eventually culminated in the exhibition. Now, in order to research the cloth, I followed a typical museum method, which was first to describe and analyse the object, gather interdisciplinary data in the form of comparable extant objects, documentary and contemporary visual evidence to deduce and then interpret its function and significance. However, the support of information provided by the conservation team was invaluable. Also vital was the expertise of the stitchers at the Royal School of Needlework, who were commissioned to make replicas of the floral motifs for the exhibition. And I'm going to come on to the importance of this collaboration shortly. In very brief summary, stylistically, I was looking at an object from the 1590s or very early 1600s. These floral motifs being typical of the period, but distinct from the later scrolling form that would appear around floral motifs from the early Stuart period. But the value of the materials in the cloth and the quality of the work, codified by sumptuary law, of course, suggested that this was made for the very highest level of customer. Scientific analysis of the cloth and dyes pointed towards northern Italian silk with a supplementary weft of silver and dyes that were imported from Mexico and India. So fantastic tangible evidence of Elizabethan global trade. The floral motifs were professionally embroidered with silk, gold and silver, and a secondary layer of embroidery, which you should be able to see there populating around the main floral motifs, is a secondary level that features animals and insects and contemporary scenes of ships and hunting. Now, these were rendered in distinctly more domestic hand, much more in line with the work of noble women's embroidery that survives in museum collections. These secondary motifs show the work of several people, probably women, as professional work was preserved of men, and domestic work, even that conducted as a genteel pastime, the preserve of women. And the motifs bore comparison to a number of high-status objects, such as the bodice, from the rainbow portrait of Elizabeth at Hatfield House. And moreover, the secondary embroidered motifs were almost direct to scale, traced copies of animals in printed books and floral motifs, representing access to the newest imported publications from both England and the continent, and symbolising Elizabethan mastery over the natural world. Neither did this research take place in isolation. So I took the approach with the cloth to research out loud. And I conducted the research with a principle of collaboration. So I invited curators, of course, but also at conferences, I opened up an open invite for attendees to come and see the cloth themselves. And the resulting input from a number of historians and academics was invaluable. Also, I decided to ask and publish research questions and theories as they arose, to air them with all the attendant problems and contradictions potentially and complications, but also to ensure that this beautiful object was seen and not hidden behind closed doors for years as the research went on. In short, armed with data from the conservation team, from my own research and from feedback from invited specialists, I felt on solid ground to posit the theory that the cloth had been cut from an item of Elizabethan court dress, perhaps even from the wardrobe of the Queen herself. And I still do, but there were a number of questions around the construction and origins of the cloth that remained unresolved and are the focus of ongoing research. And of course, this talk is a continuation of that. One of the issues around the cloth was its construction. The multiple panels of the construction suggested, actually proved, that it was made of something else before it was an altar cloth. The survival of shaping seams suggested a 3D item, like a dress. But the other problem, or rather question over its construction, is that it's not cut with selvages running vertically. In fact, the selvages run horizontally with the embroidery. Now, this is a problem, as I'm sure many in this room know, because this is not how dresses are traditionally cut. And it's here that the collaboration with conservation specialists was vital. So Libby Thompson, the lead conservator at Historic Royal Palaces, seen here, spent 1,000 hours meticulously conserving the cloth, and in the process spent more time with it than its original creators, perhaps anyone. Her intense knowledge of every part of the cloth, its stitches and seams, provided something that I couldn't alone. She took a series of digital images of the cloth, deconstructed the panel parts, and linked each seam and edge back up to its matching part. And what her meticulous work and detailed images revealed was that the altar cloth is made up of horizontal strips with a series of smaller rectangular panels and triangular panels. I haven't got a photo of that here, but her work is published in recent Textile Conservation Advances in Practice publication, so I direct you to that. It's very much worth looking at. So, what was I looking at? It wasn't an easily replicable or identifiable dress in the traditional sense. So was I looking at something with a complicated construction? Was I looking at the gathered pleats of a hoop farthingale skirt, a cape or a robe with the flowers arranged vertically? Or is it evidence of a different type of cut, related somehow to a sort of Spanish seam, sleeves, or robe seen here? Or instead, was this an item of upholstery or interior decor, or indeed a canopy? Now, this would certainly match with the horizontal cut and triangular patterns. And the construction layouts done by Libby and this pictorial evidence, together with certainly very compelling evidence of a canopy. And still a significant survival of the late 16th century embroidery in a high-status court textile, right? Not a bad association, but not a dress. Now, its potential role as a dress was difficult to let go of. Beyond the descriptive and material analysis of the cloth, as is the meaning of clothing. Now, clothing holds an emotional significance that other objects simply do not. Indeed, the wonderful Claire Wilcox, Senior Curator of Fashion at the V&A and Chair of Fashion Curation at the London College of Fashion, said clothes are nothing less than shorthand for being human. Cloth that had clothed a body felt very different in meaning to cloth that had merely been close to a body. However, academic doubt was disabusing me of its role as a dress, and yet the evidence was still not adding up. And this is where recreative practice sheds its light. I commissioned the studio at the Royal School of Needlework to recreate some of the motifs from the cloth. This is the same team who worked on the coronation and on historic and famous fashion commissions. Their take as experienced makers shed light on several things. The cloth was indeed the result of highly skilled professional work. Hooray. And their experience allowed them to share that the primary embroidery was indeed the work of one hand, or, actually, in their opinion, several hands apprenticed to stitch in the same way. And this is the same way that the RSN still works. So they teach a uniform method of stitching so that when they work on, say, the coronation robe or a wedding dress, the stitches of a uniform standard and appearance. Now, they at first thought that the cloth was a hitherto unidentified stitch technique and referred to the RSN stitch bank. Now, Stitch Bank is an invaluable resource in creative and recreative practice. It aims to digitally conserve and showcase the wide variety of the world's embroidery stitches and the ways in which they have been used by different cultures, and importantly for historians of dress, how they've been used at different times. On there are videos, written instructions, illustrations and photographs for each stitch, including historical usage and dating information. Researchers, curators, historians and students can use the site to learn about the use, structure and history of each stitch in a range of embroidery techniques and to identify a stitch on a textile. You can search by embroidery techniques, stitch uses and structures. Now, the studio almost added the Bacton stitch to the stitch bank. However, with a closer look, they very soon realised that the stitch was a very artfully rendered tiny French knot, further plied with different coloured threads for detail and shade. Now, they considered that this stitch would allow the original stitcher to work very quickly, so perhaps to a deadline for a commission. The further illumination was the technique. The embroidery was not applied first to a different fabric, which is what you'd expect to see. Embroidery took, and often still does take place, on slips that were then attached to a fabric ground. And this is to mitigate for mistakes when working with costly materials and to allow for repositioning and reuse. This fabric was especially difficult, with an additional weft of silver. But here the cloth was worked right through the expensive silk, something the RSN agreed was a demonstration of confidence, and in what a former textile curator colleague of mine from the V&A suspected to be the only example of its kind surviving in the world. So this led me to question the idea of a canopy in turn. The exceptional technical virtuosity, detail, cost, and delicate materials of the cloth would seem a little too detailed and exquisite for an outdoor or portable textile. Such things were usually more robust to weather, and were usually rendered in bolder and simpler applique patterns intended to be seen at a distance. Such things can be read in the inventories or seen in rare surviving textiles such as found at Berkeley Castle, reputedly a textile taken to the field of gold. So it seemed like a bit of a deadlock, and that's until I saw Janet Arnold's Patterns of Fashion, showing a 16th century item of dress made from the same silver chamblet silk as the Bacton altar cloth, cut with a horizontal selvage. Okay, so we have a precedent. Another significant moment was the visit of Cambridge University's Dr. Hester Lees Jeffreys, who brought with her this image. Now, the portrait is of a woman in the first decade of the 17th century, depicted in masking dress as a power of Juno. His horizontal cut and layering of the skirt and panel shapes of the bodice work with the cut and construction of the Bacton altar cloth as it survives. Now, interestingly, the process of inviting scholars to come and study the cloth was bringing similar thinking into the room. Others, such as Professor Helen Hackett, also mentioned masks and masking dresses on her visit to the cloth, as did Natalie Walker, who wrote a brilliant dissertation called Speaking Stitches, Laughing Flowers, the rainbow portrait of Elizabeth I, that explored the symbolism of the flowers in the Bacton altar cloth and its relationship to the rainbow portrait, and the potential that the ensemble featured in the rainbow portrait was a masking dress and was associated with the Cecil family in a series of masks held in the early years of the 17th century. So if we look at the construction of the Bacton altar cloth, not as a court dress in the conventional sense, but as a masking dress, then the problems around the cut of the fabric find some answer, especially in tiered skirts and bodices. If masking dresses bore a resemblance to modern theatre costume, their construction wouldn't follow the same rules as normal dress. These sketches by Inigo Jones of masks show viable designs. Lending credibility to the idea of a tiered skirt is the fact that the secondary embroidery of the cloth is arranged roughly with water motifs at the bottom, that's fish and boats, a hunting scene in the middle with stags and dogs, and butterflies and birds at the top. Now, this is something that Cynthia Jackson had spotted in her first visit to the cloth, so credit goes to her for spotting that. But we have, therefore, a thematically arranged layer working upwards of water, land and air that suggests it is supposed to be seen on the same plane, arranged horizontally. An interesting connection between this and the canopy hypothesis can also be found in the sitter of this portrait. Lucy Russell is a cousin by marriage to Anne Russell, depicted in the procession portrait, often considered to show the wedding of Anne and Lord Herbert in 1600. Lucy Russell had a number of dresses designed for her by Inigo Jones for different court masks. Anne's wedding procession was afterwards followed by a feast and a masque, and it was described that a strange dance newly was invented, performed by 8 noble women dressed in silver skirts and gold waistcoats. It was noted that the Queen herself joined the dance. So you can see that there are strands of a story here hanging in the air. They're looking to be tied up. And the well-documented practice of reuse and recycling of garments and textiles in the early modern period to adapt it from one thing to another, adapted or embellished at different stages, doesn't preclude its use as both canopy and dress, of course. Now, I realise I'm getting short of time and there's so much more I could say about this research, including questions around the chronology of the different phases of the embroidery and about how and when it got to Bacton. It was traditionally held that the cloth was bequeathed by Blanche Parry, a lifelong companion and servant of Queen Elizabeth. However, Blanche died in 1590, and the dating of these masking portraits and sketches to the final years of Elizabeth's life and to the very early 17th century may provide a clue that we should be looking not at Blanche's life, but to the dying days of Elizabeth's life and the early years of the Stuart reign. My hypothesis is that the cloth was given to Bacton in memoriam of Blanche via the Russell women. So many of the women in attendance to the Queen around the time of her death, including the elder Anne Russell, were stalwarts of the decades of service to her, and in fact many had been friends with Blanche. The small cohort of women of the Queen's bedchamber were responsible for making decisions not only around her clothing, but around gifting items of her clothing to others as a sign of favour and affection. Indeed, it was Blanche's role when she was alive. As time is short, I'm going to have to leave that particular thread hanging, but I will be happy to talk to anybody about it over coffee or lunch. Other avenues that were opened by the initial research that still remain open and unexplored certainly form part of the ongoing work on the cloth. In particular, the story of the red cochineal dye from Mexico and the blue indigo from India are a potentially important part of the expanding global story of the late 16th century. And questions also remain around the silver and gold thread, considering the vast quantities of silver imported from the Americas at that time. New World silver, mined under the jurisdiction of Spain, almost certainly by enslaved people, was the biggest export from the Americas, but it would have needed to have been commandeered by English privateers to make it into a cloth. So that's a tangible thread hanging there. For the residents of Bacton, the cloth is still very much a beloved object. The whole project would not have been possible without the church wardens and parish council members who supported me. While the cloth is now cared for in storage in Hampton Court in the Royal Ceremonial Dress Collection, a beautiful replica hangs where it used to in the church and was even blessed by the bishop in 2019. Blanche's will bequeathed £14 a year to the parish of Bacton. At the time, it was the equivalent to the annual wages of 2 skilled craftsmen, but today it contributes to a barrel of local cider at the annual Bacton barbecue. What is clear, though, is that these ideas and this research would have stuttered to a halt without the support of Libby's conservation research and digital recreation, and of the RSN's insights into technique provided by the experiences that they can share as makers and stitchers. Thank you.
We'll just take some questions. I realised that I didn't introduce you properly, Eleri. I'm so sorry.
No
so
worries.
Obviously, I'll just quickly do it now, just so you don't. Otherwise, I feel terrible. So Eleri is obviously a fashion curator and author. So she's a trustee of Royal School of Needlework and former curator of Royal Ceremonial Dress Collections and historic royal palaces. She has many, many accomplishments and has fantastic books. But I just wanted to do that because I felt terrible. I realised halfway through, I was like, oh my god, I didn't introduce Eleri properly. So we have time for questions. Who has questions? Margaret.
I was wondering, I'm also a textile conservator, so I was wondering if the team at Hampton Court Palace did any analytical testing on the silver or the dyes, if you know?
Yes, so they did. So they did on the dyes, not on the silver to date, but yes, on the dyes, and that's how we know the origins of the red cochineal and the blue indigo. Yeah.
Do you know what analytical technique they used?
No,
No, okay.
I don't. but Libby has written this incredible chapter, so definitely refer to.
We have a copy in the lab. I'll look at it.
Right, yeah, look at it. Yeah.
So we had a question time.
I wondered if you could talk a little bit more about the process of the digital recreation and what that entails.
Yeah, sure. So that's Libby's work. She photographed every part of it, and what she noticed was that in certain parts of it, and I wonder if I could. So this is my terrible sketch of the work that she did. So what she noticed was that there were some parts of sunflowers that matched up with parts on the other side. So she did, she along these lines, she sort of cut them digitally, kind of separated them, and then moved them around to match them up. So she jigsawed it back together. Now, what I was hoping when she started that work is that she would do that, and what I'd end up with was something akin to, the Armada dress or something like that, just nicely hanging in the air for me. And it wasn't. It was what these kind of strips here, and then these triangular panels and rectangular panels, some of which matched up, some of which didn't. So there are pieces that are missing. So I think probably when it got to, my hypothesis is that it got to Bacton as one thing, and they turned it into an altar cloth and some other things, maybe chalice veils or different ecclesiastical things that have not survived. So there are pieces missing. But it was this recreation that allowed me to see that, okay, it's not a dress, and in fact what it looks like is something more akin to a canopy, or something that's very much on these kind of vertical planes. That's where that journey began, of trying to think, okay, well, what could it have been?
I really like what you presented here about kind of the iterations of knowledge and how the questions have changed. Where do you next want to go with this? What are the avenues that you are most following up? How are you prioritising your next set of questions?
So the big question for me is how it got to Bacton. It doesn't make any sense that it could have gotten to Bacton other than by means of some connection to Blanche Parry and the Elizabethan court. Bacton is not a village, it's a tiny hamlet on the border. The church warden said to me, the reason it survived is because we keep our head down. They're on the border between England and Wales. We keep our head down, nobody knows we're here, kind of thing. And it makes no sense for this textile to be there other than by that connection. So what I'm really hoping to do is to try and find that route from the court to this church. It makes sense to me that that it's the ladies of the court that somehow managed to get it there. And I think that Anne Russell, when she married Lord Herbert, she became Lady of Raglan Castle, which is a stone's throw away from Bacton. So that seems to be a logical route to follow. So my next step is to pore over the Russell papers and hopefully find something that says, oh, and by the way, I've got this lovely textile, I'm going to take it to Bacton. So keep your fingers crossed.
So we have time for one more question.
Great.
Well,
lovely. Thank you so much.
So, just quickly have to show everyone Serena's email to get this PowerPoint off, or is there a way that we can? Hold on. So the PowerPoint did come through. I've just got to. Not that I'm sure.
I was ready to spring back to
Watch me know my own tech. I feel so bad about that.
Okay, here we go. Please work.
I have a question. Do you have a favorite animal? Or
animal. Yeah, for sure. So the bear that I showed is brilliant because it matches directly to Nicholas de Bruin's depiction of the bear in Four-Legged Animals of 1596. And so that was a big aha moment. And also I've got a lot of affection for it because the researcher, Anna, who found it, she was interning at the Royal Ceremonial Dress Collection. She found it was such an aha moment for her. She actually had it tattooed on her arm. So it's got an extra life now.
There's no whales, is there? On there. Is there any whales? There's no whales.
No, there's a sea monster,
Oh, yeah.
which might be a whale. You know how they were drawing whales.
Yeah. Noticing Hardwick Hall has Lacine monsters on the portrait.
Yeah. So so there is a sea monster there, which the fishing boat seems to. It's got a boat with fishermen in, and a sea monster. And then the fishing boat is empty, so it seems as though
they've gone overboard. Cool. Awesome. Well, our next presenter is Margaret O'Neill. So Margaret is is a textile conservator currently working in Philadelphia. So she graduated from the Winchester and University of Delaware program in art conservation in 2023 with a major in textiles and a minor in preventative conservation. So she's interested in historical dress from the 17th through to the 20th centuries and shares her work on social media under the name Costume Conservation. So the title of her paper today is Piecing Together the Past, Reconstructing a Closed Front Sacque Gown.
Thank you so much. So as described, this was a project that I did when I was in my graduate studies at the University of Delaware Winneter program in art conservation. So first I wanted to talk a little bit about the use of historical reproductions in the conservation world. Textile conservation is, of course, a practice of meeting the physical needs of collections, whether that is for display or long-term storage in both the public and private sector. So one of the ways we utilize reproductions is in toiles for dressing. The dressing process, creating custom mannequins or mounts for historic garments can be incredibly taxing, as it means you have to take them on and off, and on and off, and on and off. So for especially old or fragile objects, we'll create a one-to-one toile in order to assist in that dressing process. The other application, which we've been talking about in this conference and also in the presentation right beforehand, is creating, I'm going to put this in full view here. There we go. Okay, is creating full-scale reproductions of garments that are either too fragile or otherwise unavailable for display. This is a example. This is Professor Katja Rolsey of the University of Delaware, who recreated with her students the wedding gown of Jackie Kennedy when she was being married to JFK. The original is in the JFK library, but was much too fragile to be exhibited in the Anne Lowe exhibition at Winchester. So along with the conservation team, Katja was able to reproduce the dress for display. Conservators normally assist in this process. As in the previous presentation, we have access to these objects, but we also spend a ton of time with them, so we know them inside and out. And the final and probably most common application of reproductions within textile conservation is prop making. Historic garments oftentimes will not have all their components, or we don't want to use extant examples for accessories. So this is an example at Colonial Williamsburg of a fully dressed mannequin. Colonial Williamsburg does all fully dressed mannequins, so they do a lot of prop making inside that lab. So let's set the scene for this project. It was the summer of 2021. The beautiful Winneter Museum, which is outside of Wilmington, Delaware. That's about 45 minutes to an hour south of Philadelphia on Highway 95, depending on the amount of traffic and whether or not there is an Eagles game going on. So I was a rising second year at the time, and because it was during the COVID pandemic, I did my summer work project at Winneter, which is, it's typically done at an offsite museum, but it was a crazy time. So I wanted to do a short history about the Winneter Museum, as you all might not be familiar, and it's impeccably important to the story of this gown, and as we will see, couch. So the Winter Museum is the collection of Henry Francis DuPont. He inherited the Winter estate in 1926. The DuPont family came over. The kind of mythical date is January 1st, 1800. And they created a gunpowder mill and then eventually became the great DuPont chemical manufacturer. So he inherited the house in 1926. It was, kind of their more country home, but he converted it into a 175-room house, one of the largest in the United States. He started these renovations in 1929, the perfect year to start home renovations. And it was essentially to house his enormous collection of early American antiques. He was a fan of a lot of things: Holstein cows, gardening, and early American antiques. He actually took facades of buildings and rooms out of buildings, recreated the actual rooms within his house so he could use all of the molding and then put his antiques kind of in a one-to-one dollhouse scale. So he always envisioned it as opening as a museum, which it did in 1951. He was still alive. He and his wife lived on another beautiful house on the property, which is now the gift shop. And he created 2 graduate programs, an early American curatorial program and the art conservation program, both of which are still around today in a building right next to the house. There's also a wonderful library. They're doing great work on social media. You've probably all seen it. The extensive gardens and gallery space for special and permanent exhibitions. So swing by if you're ever in the Wilmington or Philadelphia area. So here is the objects we will be talking about today. Is an extant bodice, 2 engagements, and a settee that is upholstered with the sack back of the gown. We will get into exactly how it happened, but this set of objects was used to fit H.F. DuPont's colonial revival vision for the Winter Museum and his own taste. It was done in the studio of Ernest Lonano, the second of 3 Ernest Lonanos, who are all upholsterers. Ernest Lonano, the second one, was a very prolific upholsterer in the 20th century along the eastern seaboard. If you would like to know more about the dresses that he upholstered at Winter and also more about the Lonano workshop, I highly recommend checking out Alexander Izzard's 2022 thesis on the subject, which will be in the references slide of this presentation. Another important thing to note about H.F. DuPont is that he saved everything, and I do mean everything, including all of the offcuts for this dress. Now, not all of them were extant by the time that I got there. Some of them had walked off because they weren't accessioned until the 90s, 60s? I don't know, not immediately. So this one, actually, I found in the swatch box. There were some in the textile study lab. I looked through every single drawer. So I was able to find some, but if you see this pattern of silk floating around anywhere, you know where it goes. You're on notice. So I know this crowd probably knows a lot about robe à la française, but I will quickly go through it. This is a presentation I've given to many different audiences. So the robe à la française roughly was popular between 1720 and 1790, give or take a few years. And the classic style of the 1750s and 60s had those wide bateau pleats, which I know is a 19th century term. But that double box pleat in the back, that a train, it had the separate stomacher, engagements, the robings, which are the self-trim along the sides of the skirt there, and was worn under panniers and a set of stays. Here's some lovely examples of that type of gown. But what I am calling the closed front sacque was a later iteration of the style from 1775 to 1785. The pleats had somewhat narrowed in the back. The robings, instead of being curvilinear, were straighter, and it was worn with a bum pad or false rump of many different styles. It closed in the front with hooks or pins, like the other styles of the day, like Italian gowns. I bring this up because my current research is on closures in dresses, especially hook and eyes. So if you're interested in talking about that, you know where to find me. There are many extant examples of this style, even though it is not often what we associate with the robe à la française. So here are 2 examples, one from the DAR and one from the Victorian Albert Museum. And if you follow this lovely QR code, either now or in post, that will bring you to a Pinterest board of all of the extant examples I was able to find. I love finding comparable examples, so it's pretty massive. So let's jump back to our gown. The fabric was woven in the 1740s and was made into a dress at that time. Then in the 1770s, the dress was remodeled into the closed front style. We know this because the center proper left has a little bit of either a hemline or a waistline along the shoulder seam. I assumed this was cut out of the petticoat of the previous iteration of the gown, and that the robings were also cut out of that petticoat at that time. Then in the early 20th century, H.F. DuPont, after buying up most of the historic yardage in Europe, bought this dress to have his upholsterer, Ernest Lonano, make it into the upholstery of the settee. The settee was then used, aka sat on, by the DuPont family until Winterthur became a museum in the 1950s, when it was accessioned into the collection and has been on permanent display in the Massachusetts room on the 7th floor, sometimes with its accompanying bodice. So just a quick history of dress remodeling and why this silk is so important. So this is a 1740s brocade. It is hand woven. It is spot woven, which means in brocades of this day and age, the supplemental wefts will go all along the width of the fabric. However, when you're doing it by hand, you can just spot weave the supplemental wefts in the areas that you want them, which makes it incredibly lightweight, which means there's no unseemly floats on the back, and makes it incredibly valuable, and its value holds up until this day. So here is the robings I was able to sort of match up, and it did make a length that would make sense as a petticoat, which is also why I came to that supposition. So dress remodeling in the period was super widespread. This is an example from Colonial Williamsburg. I don't love how this mannequin is dressed because of the bows, so just disregard those. But the front of it is a separate piece that was attached later. By the 1830s, 40s, 50s, but even earlier in the 1800s, 1810s, 18th century silks were used to make evening gowns. By the late 19th century, they were used in fancy dress and beater applications. This is an example from the McCord Museum in Montreal. As a textile conservator, I've seen a lot of objects. There are a lot of dresses that have been used or that have 18th or late 19th century remodeling to them. It's not always labeled in museum collection databases, but it's very, very widespread, I would say. So why did they make it into a settee? That's the big question. This is a rare and expensive brocade, as we've seen. It has a history of reuse. And this is just another iteration. It was used to fit HF's colonial revival vision. The colonial revival was this sort of artistic interior decorating movement in the late 19th, early 20th century in America, spurred on by the centennial, and then kind of makes its way all the way to the bicentennial. But H.F. DuPont used historic yardage for all of his curtains, which were changed 4 times a year with the seasons, all of his slip covers, which were also changed 4 times a year with the seasons. And because he was buying so much yardage, because everybody was buying this type of yardage, he did sort of transition into using alternative sources, which included this dress. And for some reason, H.F. DuPont didn't see this dress as a pristine example. I don't know what he would think a pristine example was. He was not into dresses. He was not into clothing. He collected a lot of furniture. So take that as you will. Here's some other examples of dead dresses, ex-dresses at Winterthur. This one in particular, this was made into a slip cover, and as you can see on the underside, just the amount of fading that has happened. Most of the textiles at Winterthur that were made from ex-dresses have since been replaced with reproduction Scalamandre fabric, but the remnants still remain within the collection. So the studio of Ernest Lonano did this very simply. They simply unpicked the sides, shoulders, and waist seam. And as you all know, sack back gowns are incredibly easy to reuse because of the large swaths of fabric that are available within the sack back. The style is literally to show off the expensive fabric. So the objectives for my treatment were to pattern out the bodice, map out the settee pieces of the offcuts onto the sacque back to figure out the exact dimensions of that sacque, and then recreate a replica to attach the original bodice for ultimate display. What we knew off the bat, fabric was 21.5 inches wide. We could tell that from some of the offcuts that we had. The settee piping was cut on the bias, which means that we were going to have large swaths of fabric that was just unaccounted for, because as we all know, cutting on the bias takes up a lot of different fabric. And although the rovings were not used on the settee, not all of them were present, and therefore they would not make it into the final reconstruction because we didn't have enough evidence to really incorporate those. But they were unpicked and flattened for some reason, which we never got to the bottom of that. So my first order of business was to really look at the offcuts. Ernest Lanana was a master at his craft and wanted to use the largest and most unmarred pieces within the settee, meaning the juicy bits with all of the information were in the offcuts. So this is the top of one of the pleats. You can see that extremely dirty section, and then clean, and then extremely dirty. The dirty sections would be what was outside, the clean sections what would be inside, and you could still see the directionality of the pleats, so I was able to actually make little fabric mock-ups and figure out exactly how that pleat went together. And then probably the most important wayfinding tool was the hemline. So this hemline is, again, very dirty and has, I don't know if you can see it, but it has thread scarring on either side of it, which denotes it as the hemline. Then looking at the settee itself, here it's faint, but it's there. The cross of the center front and the hem, which established a good wayfinding point. And then starting to take the offcuts and matching them up to pieces on the settee. So this was a really exciting find with the hemline matching up and the pattern matching up exactly from one offcut to the settee. Unfortunately, I couldn't get a good picture of this, but the long hemline pieces right here, if you take them and then you wheel yourself under the settee like you're doing an oil change on a car, you can see the selvage or the seam allowance edge on the underside of the settee seat pieces, and that matches up thread for thread with those long hemline pieces, which was very exciting. So in order to really figure out how this went together, I had to create a digital puzzle piece board. So in order to do that, I took a picture of every single piece of the settee, and then I also patterned it out so I'd have exactly the scale. I put those all into Photoshop and started playing around. And as you can see, this is slightly chaotic. I only have 5 lengths of fabric because I only found evidence of 5 widths of hemline, but this was really puzzling me. I then moved over to creating a half-scale replica, and the sacque was just really long. It was like a 70-inch back seam. Oops, I don't know what happened here. There we go. So I had a lot of questions at this point. Did our sacque really have 5 lengths, or did it have 6, like I was seeing in all of the patterns I was looking at? Why was the hem so uneven? Did our sacque really only have 1 pleat? I was only finding evidence of 1 pleat. Is 70 inches too long for a sacque? Did our sacque need gores? When I was looking at the extant patterns and Janet Arnold and other books, the sacques often had gores that would help with incorporating panniers, but I wasn't finding any evidence of those within the extant material. And then how's the skirt pleated? There wasn't a lot of information about that. And when you have questions like this, I highly recommend going to Colonial Williamsburg. If you are unfamiliar with Colonial Williamsburg, it is one of the largest living history sites in the United States, I believe. They have a wonderful collection of extant objects, but they also have a wealth of knowledge with historic tradespeople, both in Colonial Williamsburg organization themselves and nearby. Brooke will be giving a talk later this afternoon, which you should go see, about making 18th century gowns. So the curator Neil and the conservators Gretchen and Jackie helped me to access many different franceses, and they gave incredibly important construction detail, including these tacking stitches, which is important for the structure of the gown, we will use later, the details of the silk hem facing, and then figuring out how a skirt would have been pleated without the use of gores. I was like, Neil, I'm not leaving until we find one without gorse. And we did. So the big takeaways from this trip were that the back seams of the sacque were between 55 and 63 inches, not 70. Skirts normally had gorse, but not always. They always had 2 box pleats, so our sacque definitely had 6 lengths, not 5. So with a little bit more fiddling around, this is what I came up with. The black outline is the dimensions of the sacque. The offcuts are in blue, and the settee pieces are in green. And here is some examples from the settee sort of mapped on there. So you can see that little section on the arm came out of length 2. The little cut piece from the study collection came off of there. So it was very exciting and satisfying to see this all come together. And now it's time to do the actual work of making the recreation. So we decided as a conservation and curatorial team to make this inspired by toiles. We wanted the viewer to feel the absence of the material while also still understanding what it would have looked like. I was pushing for hot pink at one point, but we decided to do a very muted tone to sort of denote the absence of the piece. It was meant to contrast from the original bodice, but not distract. And we decided to use a Kona cotton for this. This is high quality quilting cotton that's available in the United States. We also made a contrasting petticoat. Also meet Beverly, my wonderful mannequin. It was a complementary color to denote the absence from the upholstery, but also we couldn't dress it without a petticoat. That would just look odd. And here's me making the reproduction sacque. I attached the sacque back to the linen lining so I could do those tacking stitches so it would have that structure, and I also did an 18th century style hem facing. I did machine sew the long side seams, however, just for time's sake. But those are some of the best whip stitches of my life that I am doing right there. And then we decided to attach it to the dress with the use of magnetic closures. Magnets, I didn't want to sew it to the dress permanently. I wanted it to be able to be taken on and off easily. And magnets create a strong yet easily reversible bond, which is something that we're always looking for in conservation. To do that, I did have to sew on a placket on both side seams to match the magnets on the side seams of the sacque back. And then I did, instead on the front, I sewed magnets onto a twill tape strip that could easily be sandwiched with the original bodice. And here's the final product. Very happy with how it turned out. And if you're, again, around Wilmington or Philadelphia, it's actually on display at the moment in Transformations in the Special Exhibitions Gallery, and it will be up until January 5th of 2025. You have a little bit more time if you want to see it. And of course, the dress was my size, and I had a pattern, so I did in fact make one for myself. If you're interested, there's some videos up on YouTube about this style of dress and how I recreated it. And there's also a pattern. As part of my second year, I did a study on extant patterning, and this was one of the patterns that I produced because I had spent so much time with this garment already. So you can go and check that out as well if you're interested. Here are the references that I consulted. Alexander Izzards is at the top if you're interested, and also some further reading. And finally, I would like to thank Laura Mina and Kate Sommel, who were my supervisors for this presentation, Dr. Laura Johnson, Dr. Catherine DeAnne Rober, my curatorial supervisors, as well as Gretchen, Jackie, Neil, Heather, and Brooke from Colonial Williamsburg. And a special shout out to the Andrew W. Mellon Fund for allowing me to present at this conference, getting me here. Yeah, if you have any questions, Cal or also feel free to come up and talk to me or email me.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that. Questions? I'm sure there are.
So you said that I'm not actually asking about the dress. I'm asking about
The settee?
So you said that the slip covers were taken. Is there, I'm assuming
So this
there are no plans to actually deconstruct what has been permanently attached?
No, so this isn't actually a slip cover. This is the actual upholstery. There is a slip cover for the couch,
Of course.
which is because why
You
would
need that,
but it's not normally displayed as that. Yeah.
I'm really interested in H.F. DuPont's deciding that dress fabric should be repurposed into upholstery.
Yeah.
Because what we've seen is that dresses get repurposed into dresses by women. And I'm curious if there's a dimension there of a man seeing a woman's dress and not valuing it in the same way and seeing it through a different lens.
Yeah, that's entirely possible. This was a pretty, from what we can tell, this was a decently widespread phenomenon at the time. So he wasn't the only person doing it. But yeah, I've definitely thought about that. It's just like, okay, this is what we're doing with the dresses now. But
Could you just tell us something about the sensory experiences of the dress that you made for yourself?
yes, so I couldn't find a hand-woven silk brocade that was a little outside of my budget. So I opted for kind of a similar weight silk taffeta, and it's both incredibly comfortable and uncomfortable. I've noticed that I'm just not used to dealing with that much volume of fabric, but it's just a different feeling. It's not necessarily uncomfortable. Even with the stays, they're not uncomfortable at all. So it definitely makes you stand more upright, though, I will say, shoulders back. But I enjoy wearing that gown, and actually my sister wore it to the Bridgerton experience of all places, and I remember like lacing her into the stage, and she goes, "Oh, this is fun. I get why you do this."
I have a question about, you said it was your size.
Yeah.
Did you learn anything interesting about the body of the person that owned it initially, thinking about, or did you have to tweak it much to fit yourself?
I did have to tweak it a little bit, but not a ton. I think they were a little bustier than me, but not by much. It was like pretty spot on. But yeah, there wasn't a ton of evidence of the body that would have been in there, unfortunately.
We have time for one final question. I mean, I have a question about how many other things in the collection could you do the same project with?
So the reason we could do this project, the project with this one, is because we just had so much of it, and we had the original bodice. So there aren't a lot of bodices floating around in the collection, unfortunately. There's a lot of like one sleeve or a skirt, but the bodice made this one possible. But there's probably a couple more that you could feasibly do it with.
Oh, and I did also have a question about why do you think in particular they chose this textile? Because it doesn't strike me, or maybe I'm just misunderstanding, as being something that you'd want to upholster a seat with, that people are going to sit on a lot. Like, is it a heavy duty? It's not a heavy duty brocade, right?
No, it's not a heavy duty brocade. And they actually, there were several areas where the upholstery had been repaired, either with a patch from one of those offcuts or darning. Granted, I cannot really put into words the amount of places to sit within Winneter. There are so many options for chairs, there are so many options for seating. So I don't think it was heavily used in any sense, but yeah, it's not, you wouldn't go, yes, I want to really have everyone sit on that chair all the time. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for your presentation.
Awesome. So, just grab up the presentation. So our next presenter is Elizabeth Elliott. So, pop this on the screen. Okay, so Elizabeth is an independent historian and associate of the Museums Association, and she holds a master's degree in fashion from Norwich University of Arts. Her research focuses on altered, reassembled, and recycled garments and textiles in historic collections, and she currently works for the National Trust in Hampshire. And so her paper today is called Uncovering Hidden Garments in Historic Collections, Exploring the Afterlife of Clothing Through Reconstruction. Thank you.
Hello, thank you for having me. Yes, I'll be looking at uncovering hidden garments in historic collections, particularly reused textiles in the English country houses. I couldn't have asked for a better lead into this than the previous two presentations, so I think you'll see quite a few parallels in it. For this talk, I'll be following a project that I undertook a few years ago, investigating the story of a piece of embroidered textiles housed at Blickling Hall in Norfolk, which is currently cared for by the National Trust, known as the Shell Quilt. I'll be presenting this project in a few phases, which firstly looks at reassembled textiles in general in the historic house, examining the quilt and investigation into the provenance of the object and its embroidery, and finally a reproduction garment which I created to test my theory that this quilt once stood as a skirt. The project is still ongoing, but this is what I've got so far. So the reuse and reassembly of textiles, as we've already heard, is a well-documented practice that goes back as far as the Bronze Age. Textiles are a precious resource worthy of scrupulous reuse and redesign. So from loom to rags, as many times as you can use the textiles is a good thing, and usually clothing will take part, so like one or two of these phases. In the 16th century, valuable textiles were often recorded as being reused and reshaped in a process called translating, and many objects, both clothing and textile furnishings, still bear signs of a previous form. So here are just a few examples from archives and letters and inventories of textiles that have been restitched to suit a new function. Even Sarah Duchess of Marlborough, in one of the inventories at Blenheim, she's one of the richest women in England at the time, and even her clothes were made up into some bed furnishings as well. So this is a practice that's used by all layers of society. This is a really lovely example of a little work bag that has been made out of a waistcoat. This is really lovely example of not only the function being changes, but also who is using it. The waistcoat would have been commissioned for a man, and this little bag would more likely have been used by a woman. So we see textiles that are passing from one hand to another along with their function. And here we have the aftermath of an early Norwich shawl, originally made in 1792, being cut into bed hangings in the 20th century. The remaining pieces were kept by the family after the majority of the counterpane was cut to fit the four-posted bed. You can just see the remains sort of going around three sides of the bed, and then the headboard would have sat in the centre of the counterpane. And this is the Chinese bedroom at Blickling Hall, which is where we're going to find the shell quilt, which I'd like to talk to you about today. It first came across this quilt a few years ago. We originally had a look at it as a potential object for a seaside-themed exhibition, which didn't end up taking place, but when it was unfurled, began to notice the unusual construction of the quilt. So you can see here that quite a few of the shells have been cut through, and where the fabric has been folded over. So immediately we've got some notes that this quilt was originally part of another object. From afar, you can't really tell. There's been really careful placement of the pieces, but once you get up close, you can start to notice that this used to be something else. So this is a diagram that I did just to sort of help show exactly where the panels are. There are 20 in total. 6 of them are quite large, and there are slithers of the selvage which can be seen on these sides here, so we don't fit. That's as wide as the silk gets. And most of the panels have been cut at the side, but there's one seam that survives from the original textile. So this was my starting point. This was the information that the National Trust had about the textile to begin with. The embroidery fits the profile for sometime in the 17th century. The style of the quilt possibly points towards 18th century. We know that this has been in the collection of the family, and the hall was bequeathed to the National Trust by Lord Philip Kerr in 1940. We've got the dimensions, and of course all these lovely shells to view. I went to the archives, and I was able to find a really clear indication that the shell was in the inventory of 1947 in the upper anteroom. This would have been taken after the National Trust took over care of the hall. And then we jump back a bit to 1908, and it appears again. This is when the Lothian family were still at the hall. And now quite a jump, back to 1793, taken after the death of the second Earl of Buckinghamshire, John. A white quilt with needlework and green lining is recorded in one of the attic rooms, stored with some of the other fine textiles. I'll show you a picture of the back of the quilt, but it has a lovely bright green lining, so I think this is a good candidate to show that in 1793 this piece was a quilt, so whatever object it was before, this was constructed before then. So again, looking at this quilt's construction, as I said, it's made of 20 panels that are around 15 centimetres wide. In a few places, the seams of these larger panels, the selvage is still visible, which gives us some really valuable dating information. And there are signs of use. There are some water stains to the centre left of the silk, which point to potential laundering when someone's accidentally dropped their cup of tea or something. There are also ink stains at the top edge of the quilts, so it shows this quilt saw use as a coverlet. It had a functioning role in the household, and it wasn't just a sewing project that was done for enjoyment or so precious that it was kept or locked away. It was used in someone's bedchamber and possibly remade because they enjoyed the embroidery on it. So here's the lovely green silk on the back. You can see where it has worn away, that you've got just a thin layer of wool wadding that's been placed in between and a little peak at the selvage there. And you can see the pattern of the quilts a little clearer here. And although the quilting is really good, it's clear that it's been done domestically. It's a little bit wobbly in places, but still someone's taken a lot of time and care over this. And this is the original seam. We can tell that this is from the original garment because it goes underneath the embroidery. There are 4 shells that sit on top of it. And if you look very closely, you can see a slight difference in hand. So we've got 2 phases of making. And these are the shells which initially arose suspicion. If you look hard enough, you can start to match some of the shells up. And there has been some attempts to re-embroider the other halves of the shells to try where they've unravelled, but it's still clear to see what was there originally and what was in this later phase. So after lots of looking at the shells, managed to match up all these pairs, and then bit of digital reconstruction, we know that these 6 panels once sat next to each other, and the selvage went top to bottom. So we've got 282 centimetres and 84 centimetres wide that we know existed in this configuration. The embroidery itself is done really high quality, so we know it's probably done by a professional embroidery house and was very expensive when it was first made. And something in this configuration with the panels, we're likely looking at a skirt. So here's some of the details of the embroidery, which is really beautifully done. I did note while looking at all these shells, there are over 250 of them, and a lot of them are really high quality like this. There are some of them which are not so high quality, so it looks like there's more than one embroiderer working on this at the same time, which is quite nice to see. The grey lines would have originally been silver. They have oxidised over time. But if you look close enough, there are 6 different shells that have been used, 6 different designs. Although each one has different patterns and colours used in them, it's a really creative piece. They're all facing different directions, so it can be quite difficult to tell at first if there is a pattern. And this is a close-up of some of the silver thread, which you can see has oxidised quite a bit, but it would have been gleaming to begin with. This is a little recreation that I did of one of the shells, so you can see it would have really sparkled when it was originally made. So the profile of this of the embroidery sort of fits for the 17th century. There was quite a few portraits that I looked through where you can see this really fantastical embroidery. There's a really lovely poem put together by John Taylor in 1631 called The Praise of the Needle that highlights the range of stitches used in Jacobean embroidery and also the range of subjects, which also points to seas and rivers. I've struggled to find a reference to shells yet, but I live in hope of finding one. Usually the subjects of embroidery tends to stem around botanical, but we do get this flurry of really beautiful, fantastical embroideries. So looking at some portraits, particularly one from Lady Anne Montague in the government art collection, it looks like it could suit around the 1630s as an original piece. But the subject of shells is still a mystery. I haven't been able to find that many examples of purely shell-based embroideries. If anyone's heard of them, please let me know. But I did have better luck looking in some natural history books. With trade routes expanding across the globe, there was more natural history about, more curiosity about natural history. And a lot of rich households would have curiosity cabinets with shells in them, which would fetch huge prices if the shell was particularly rare. And natural history scholars such as Ilse Uberani and Conrad Gessner produced volumes of illustrated books depicting creatures and shells across the world. And in some of these books, this is Conrad Gessner, you can see the similarities. So there would have been reference material for these sort of designs. So potentially someone decided they wanted to turn to a walking curiosity cabinet and have shells all over their garments. So although I was able to find a home for 6 of the panels, it does leave the mystery of these last ones, and I really wanted to see if I could place them. And I thought that this could be perhaps solved if I could find a pattern. So the shells are roughly arranged in this offset grid pattern, but it's not obeyed across the quilt, which makes it really confusing. These areas that I've highlighted in yellow, it does obey a pattern, which I've just put on the right here. Everywhere else, they're slightly more chaotic, but they're still nicely placed, but there are fewer in those panels, which do end up in the back of what I theorise is the skirt. So this could be a way to save time and thread, but these panels are the most uniform. So if we look at the little panels at the side, they do fit into this pattern, because when they have 2 or more shells, then I can sort of slot them in. So I theorised that there was another panel that has been cut up to make up the side of the quilt. The last piece is used. There are some shells in them, but they're not as densely packed, and they do sort of go into this wavy line across. And looking at some other portraits, I've noticed that some of them have embroidery along the border. So taking all of this I theorise turns into this, which would hopefully make enough have enough fabric left over to make a skirt, but I thought we need to actually try this. So I made some lino prints and mapped out where all the shells sat on each of the panels, and printed it out, and then made it up. I did have to sort of guess as to the dimensions of where a trim could be, but looking at portraits gave me a clue as to where I could potentially place them, and it does come up with enough fabric for a densely pleated skirt. And this was very useful when I was presenting some of my research to my colleagues and to the volunteers who work at Blickling. When you're viewing the skirt, it's not immediately obvious that there's enough fabric here that could make up something like this, but this was a really good way to sort of demonstrate a before and after. And my plans for the skirt is to basically take this and cut it up and make it back into the quilt. But that's a story for another day. Thank you for listening, and thank you to the National Trust for their encouragement with my research.
Thank you. Questions? Do you have any?
Yeah. Thank you for that. That's a really lovely investigation into it. I'm so glad you said where the shells came from, because that's what was questions I had as well. I'm just wondering, because it's a quilted piece, for the attachment of the pleats at the top, do you think that was integral to the fabric, or would it have had a separate fabric strip that then reduced the bolt so it was able to be densely pleated into the waistband?
I think that could definitely be possible. The shells on the quilt in the panels, they go right up into the edge, which you wouldn't have on a garment, so it's not really possible to say. So I did allow myself sort of a couple of inches to sort of taper in if possible, but for the moment they do seem pretty square. So I think a lot of the panels that were missing were sort of from the hem, which would make sense if it had been worn and dirtied over time, that they would be cut, but it's also possible there may have been some at the top. Yeah, that's sort of educated guesswork at this point.
Good question, and potentially this is a question for our three speakers thus far, but how vital or important or possible is your project, and are these three projects because of Photoshop? Is this something that we could have done without that digital element, without that digital tool, and now that we're more well versed in it than potentially, previously, at least for me, is that something that's really enabled it and enabled this process as part of that, reconstructive, recreative method?
Yeah, I would say it would be possible to do without Photoshop. I think it was really preferable to be able to design this digitally and then go and get the fabric, because there's obviously a cost involved in getting that fabric and doing that project, taking up a lot of floor space. You could also do it in half scale, but being able to just play around with it digitally was really helpful, particularly when I had all the different panels. The shells were different on every one of them, so keeping track of what was where. It was also really helpful for actually plotting out where all these 6 shells fell, because just looking at it in person, that would have taken a lot longer to do without the help of digital technology.
I had a question about the pattern you used for the skirt. Were you basing it on anything in particular, or just sort of trying to see what would work as you were going?
But patterns of fashion definitely helped with that. I tried to keep as true as I could to the fabric that I knew I had. So I sort of just kept to that and sort of saw where that left me, and it wasn't too far off of what I'd seen in portraits. So happy with that so far. I do intend on trying it again. That's sort of like my first attempt, so this project is still ongoing.
Yeah, and it'd be interesting to try it with different sort of like padding or sort of support structures underneath, because I imagine that you'd sort of want to display shells. If you were.
Yeah, absolutely. I had a little petticoat underneath that when it was photographed, but it really needs like a proper roll to see them, because they do sort of blend in. That offset grid pattern, it doesn't show that much when you've got all the pleats, but it is really beautiful when it moves, because then you can see them. And without the quilting on there, all these silver shells would have just sort of sparkled and danced across. It would have been really beautiful. So.
Can you just say a little something about how it felt when you were doing the embroidery? What the experience of doing the embroidery was?
Yep, that was my first experience of doing sort of gold work, so frustrating came to mind. Yeah, an immense amount of respect for whoever did the original embroidery. Using such a thin silk with the silver wire and silk on top of it, something I didn't mention, all these shells were done straight onto the silk. And there's not much pulling around them, so that's why I say they were done by a professional embroidery shop, because my silk did not end up in that good a quality, even when that survived a couple of 100 years. So yeah, there's yeah.
And how large are they?
They're roughly about sort of 5 centimeters. They are all the different the 6 kind of designs are identical on either one, so they've likely been patterned over, and but all the range of stitching in them is just incredible.
Oh, and how it's silk fabric?
Yeah.
And how fine is the silk fabric? What kind of silk is it?
It's very high quality. It's very thin. It has degraded a little, but it looks like it hasn't seen, apart from that staining, a tremendous amount of use and wear. There wasn't any obvious marks on it from the original wear as a garment. So there are 1 or 2 seams which are almost sort of this long. They almost look like darts, but I think they may have been from the remaking into the quilt, and they're possibly taking out a stain or a tear or something, because they don't make sense as to the construction with how much fabric they take out.
Back to that.
Sorry, you might have mentioned this. Is it currently on display at Leicester or is it in storage?
No, it's on storage at the moment. Fingers crossed I might get on display one day. I'll have to talk to the curator.
I have a question about, have you done any research into who possibly owned it?
Yes.
If it stayed in the family and you're dating it sort of maybe the first half of the 17th century?
Yes, I have. I did, I should mention, I wrote this up into an article that was published with the Journal of Dress History last December, so I do have more detail there. But if the dates are as I believe they are, then it would either be Philippa or Frances Hobart, who were the first and second wives of John Hobart. They were both the daughters of dukes, and this was in a particular time of wealth for the Hubbard family. So that would make sense with having something of this quality made. They were both married around the same time, and that portrait that I mentioned of Anne Montague that looks quite similar to the embroidery here, she's depicted in a wedding outfit. So that sort of garment was quite fashionable around that time, so it points to lining up, but I do want to do more research into that because obviously I can't pin anything at the moment.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Thank you.
Okay.
Yeah, great.
So our final speaker is Gigi Coulson. So Gigi is a sociologist, author, and historical costumer whose independent research focuses on the Italian peninsula from 1350 to 1800. She studies and teaches about historical women's lives, dress, accessories, and material culture. In 2023, Gigi founded Costumers of Colour, Inc., a non-profit to create opportunities for inclusion of BIPOC, so Black, Indigenous, and people of colour, in historical costuming. Presentation today is Power in the Margins, People of Colour in Dress History and Costuming. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, good morning. I'm Gigi, and I'm here today to speak with you a little bit about people of color in dress history and costuming. Here's a layout of what we'll be covering. The acronym POC stands for People of Color, or Person of Color if it's singular. So we'll talk about how this person of color started in dress history. We'll touch on the 6 degrees of dress history and how dress history is connected to other sciences. We'll define the margin and describe it a little bit. We'll talk about community and inclusion before we conclude. So where did I start in dress history? I started here. I started with this 15th century fresco by Ghirlandaio. I wanted to wear what a 15th century Florentine woman would wear, like the ladies here in the corner. Since I'm a costumer who's also a sociologist, this is where things get exciting, for me at least. I focused on the main character here in the front in the red, orange, and gold, this lady. I wanted to know who she was and why she had on these particular fabrics, colors, accessories. I wondered how much they cost and who would have made them. I noticed the different ages of the ladies with her and that their garments were different, and I wondered why. So in just 10 minutes of observing this first fresco, I had gone through what I called the 6 degrees of dress history. This idea of mine is based on the 6 degrees of separation theory that came out of the Small World Project in the early aughts. It is an idea that all people are 6 or fewer social connections from one another. So I've learned that dress history is 6 or fewer social connections from all other social and physical sciences. So let's walk through that together. So while conducting dress history research, we can use the 5 W's. So who? This is Giovanna degli Albizzi. She had married Giovanni Tornabuoni's son. And so the who connects us to Italian history, women's studies, and onomastics, which is the study of names and naming. We ask what? This is a joinea and a gamora of dyed wool and silk woven into a brocade fabric. So that connects us with fashion history, textile studies, biology, and organic chemistry. Why? She was just married. And so that connects us a little bit to economics, political science, sociology, and sociocultural anthropology. The when? Well, 1480s, early Renaissance, that's history. And where? Florence, Italy. So that connects us with geography, cartography, and GIS. This connection to me is beautiful. In the book, Sociology of Clothing by Charlotte Perkins Gilman, around 1915, and she was a person in the margin of her time, she connected sociological theory to understanding clothing by exploring what clothing tells us about the leisure class, conspicuous consumption, and status symbols. And she dives into the nature of displaying the wealth of men and families through women's adornment and leisure, which is exactly what Giovanna was doing, or what she was painted to do, is display the wealth of her family. So dress history helped tell the story of this Florentine culture to this sociologist. And this is not a new phenomenon. For thousands of years, clothing and textiles have carried stories. In my study of women, dress history has helped me track down the truths of 15th century women like Caterina Sforza and Violante Malatesta. Violante is here. I want to make this dress as well. Asking the question, what did they wear and why, is a large, multifaceted research endeavor in itself. But uncovering the answer to that question is something that occurs within academia, and also as independent researchers like myself go further and gather the experience of how it felt to make and wear the dress of historical people as part of reenactment, living history, or public history. For reenactors, knowing what textiles a garment would be made of, how the fabric would have been manufactured, dyed, purchased, cut, and pieced together, and how the garment would feel as you slip it on, tie it, or pin it. All of these things are pieces of the dress history puzzle that help us understand historical people and cultures. It is heartening to me that at this festival there are representatives from both academia and beyond academia, because I believe the field of dress history is bettered and furthered by this inclusion. So now that we've covered the dress history piece, let's connect it to the margin. And that connection is me and costumers like me. I have been a Black woman, true story, during the course of the path outlined here. College, grad school, my career, and my hobby. So I'm a scientist by training and trade. And as far as dress history and reenactment, I've studied women on the Italian peninsula for about 15 years. I now know that after collecting and or reviewing both qualitative and quantitative data from 2 international costuming organizations and becoming a member of the academic Medievalists of Color group, that my experiences as a Black woman in hobby historical costuming and dress history research mirrors the experience of others like me in costuming spaces as well as in academia. I would describe our collective costuming experiences as people of color as fun and intellectually fulfilling, mixed with racism-related stress due to individual racial biases, sprinkled with a heavy dose of institutional inequity and exclusion. Why? Because we're not supposed to be there. We're supposed to be in the margin, and our presence there makes white people uncomfortable. Why? Because we're supposed to be silent and in the margin. Not this kind of margin. This margin is delightful, and I love the cat. I love Margin Elliott, don't you? Now, I learned about the margin the hard way, because every time I step outside of it, I'm told to go back to it either overtly or covertly. So for reenactors in Italy, this is not the margin. Wearing Sartor reproduction silk brocade from the 14th century is definitely not the margin for living historians. Portraying and or interpreting 15th century noblewomen, 14th century noblewomen, 10th century noblewomen, there is a pattern here. And 6th century high-class women is also not the margin. So me being in these spaces has resulted in almost every instance, being told I'm not where I'm supposed to be. You may be able to relate if you've ever seen someone amazed that a woman could be a scientist or a pilot or even just a good driver. A personal example would be while wearing this orange silk one in the center. This is a shot silk gonella based on a 14th century fresco of St. Ursula and her maidens. While at the event, when I was wearing this dress, I was told that my group of all white reenactors besides me should be put in the very back of the reenactment, because for the public, in 1387, there would not have been anyone like me there. This person was comfortable telling me this because they were uncomfortable, and they were uncomfortable because I was there existing and reenacting. They felt it was their place to tell me I was not in mine. And this is not a singular experience. It has happened to me at costuming events, at archives in Italy when I'm researching, at International Medieval Congress in Leeds, at work when I'm out in the forest as the lead scientist on a habitat restoration project, when I'm contacting 16th century groups or 6th century groups. That's my new jam, is 6th century. Who knew I would ever go that early? When I'm contacting 6th century groups in the UK to find a group to play with and showcase my research. It happens almost every single time someone in the center thinks I am outside of the margin because they have decided that is where marginalized people are supposed to remain. So what is the margin, like you're talking about? Well, a simple, direct definition. Margin literally means the edge of the page. To be marginalized is to be on the periphery, the fringe, or the edge of a group, a community, a society, a culture, a country. So when groups of people are marginalized, they're figuratively kept in society's margins, away from the center where power and privilege lie. Examples of marginalized group would be the disabled, women and other gender minorities, those of low income levels, ethnic minorities, and people of the global majority, like me. Let's delve into the margin as explored and theorized by bell hooks in the 1900s. First, let me tell you who bell hooks is. She is all these things here listed. She is of African heritage and is most well known for her feminist theory that recognizes that social classifications like race, gender, identity, class are interconnected, and that ignoring their intersection creates oppression towards women and change their experience of living in society. Ms. Hooks theorized that in any defined group, especially one with power, there is a center and a margin, where the center has more power, influence, and control than the margin. This is called center-margin theory. Joseph S. Walker, a man of European heritage, so a man in the center, actually helps explain the function of the margin. He says it carries a strong negative connotation. It is a place created by the power structure to hold certain communities in silence and to limit their access to power. So to be marginalized is to be denied. The margin is supposed to be a space of powerlessness and restriction. Systems of power use the margin to exclude and disempower groups. So this margin is present in dress history and in the costuming community and in academia, and this margin is not new. Both modern and historical people have faced this marginalization, and you don't have to take my word for it. For evidence of this margin, you could listen to the interviews of people of color on these two shows, Voices of Color on Facebook and Costuming in Color on YouTube. They are both free. And in these shows, people of color talk about their experiences in historical costuming, cosplay, experimental archaeology, and the vintage scenes. You could look for evidence of this margin by chatting with someone like Dr. Jonathan Shu or other medievalists of color about the realities of race and racism in the profession. And the statement written by them, Statement on Race and Medieval Studies, is really eye-opening and insightful. These are hyperlinks, so if you're able to download this PDF later, just click on the hyperlink to get there. For further evidence of this margin in dress history, you could study people like this. Their snazzy clothing is what drew me into them, but when you read their life experiences of the historical marginalized people like Caterina Sforza or Alessandro de' Medici or John Blank, Caterina, in particular, was said to be so much like a man in political savviness and military strategy that she could not be a real woman. And that sounds familiar, doesn't it? However, restriction and limited access to power is not the whole story of the margin, and it's not the whole history either. Both modern marginalized groups and historical marginalized people found power in the margin. How? Well, author Bell Hooks explains that the oppressed, exploited, and colonized can choose to use the margin as a place of resistance. Ms. Hooks wrote that the margin offers to one the possibility to imagine alternatives if you view the margin not as a place of powerless and denial, but as a place of openness where you can tap into the unlimited power of knowing. You can read all about this in her essay. It's free on the internet, Choosing the Margin as a Space of Radical Openness. So how does the margin morph from a place of limitation to a place of access? How is that possible? From my experience, and also in Ms. Hooks' own words, we find the answer in community. The power structure may have placed people like me in the margin, but I am not there alone. Community is the catalyst or the chrysalis for the margin to become a position of strategy and not silence. A person in the margins can envision themselves outside the definitions created by white supremacy. People in the margin have the ability to both redefine themselves and to access new perspectives on society as a whole. For Ms. Hooks, the margin is a place where one can choose an alternate way of thinking about the margin. She wrote, "Margins need not be a place of deprivation, but rather a space for radical possibility. All people can realize this possibility, this creativity, this power, when we come together in community." I can attest to that because I have found a community via the nonprofit she told you about named Costumers of Color. In Costumers of Color, we promote the inclusion and belonging of Black, Indigenous, and other people of color in all spheres of costuming and dress history research. I am the founder and executive director of Costumers of Color. And our nonprofit uses the margin as a position of strategy and creates inclusive educational costuming events, plans trips to participate in historical costuming abroad and to conduct dress history research, and awards a yearly scholarship to a costumer of color. We are ambitious and we have been successful. I, through Costumers of Color, am actually going to be back here next year in the UK. I'm going to lead a group on a trip to Bath so we can live our best Georgian lives, donning historical clothing, visiting museums, playing croquet, and living in an 18th century townhouse for a week. Via Costumers of Color, I have met the most amazing people. I have really found my community. And through them, I found out about this festival, and I'm standing before you today. So the people in my community are people like Noel, of Costuming Drama, Dr. Meg, a fancy historian on Instagram, Marvin Alonzo Greer holding the chair here. He is an amazing historian, and he's Mag the Historian on Instagram. Christine of Sosteen, Dr. Robin Reich, Nicole of Grounded History, Hugh Goffinet, this young man here in the center. He had just started college when we interviewed him on Costumers of Color, and he's just inspirational to me. Jess and Nina are two members of our board, the one with the locks and the veil at the top. Stitching Addiction and the Vintage Guidebook are these two ladies at the shore, facing away from the camera, and Bernadette Banner. I am actually actively looking to expand this community, especially to those studying 6th century bronze. So if you know any people of color that are into the 6th century, please send them my way. So, final thoughts. Dress history is a robust gateway that connects to so many other disciplines. The more the merrier is what I say. Margins can be a space for radical possibility if we access community and if we choose to use our collective power. The field of dress history is bettered and furthered by diversity of thought, experience, and expertise. It just is. But action is required. Those in the center need to reach out to those in the margin and partner. Facilitate dialogues to point us to more inclusive futures. Challenge your own biases. Speak up when you see inequity. Judge success by who you include and how they succeed. You can watch something like Smarter in Seconds by Blair Imani on Instagram, or read her book, Read This to Get Smarter, or learn with her on Patreon. I love Blair Imani. She's not paying me to say this. I just or do something else to educate yourself so you cannot behave in a way that is oppressive to people like me. I'll have a couple of links at the end. Again, hyperlinks if you download the PDF. places you can go for education on how you can support the marginalized people. I decided to include this motto by Isabella d'Este, a powerful woman in the margin of 15th century Italy. Nec spe, nec metu. It means without hope, without fear. We don't have to hope or wish that things could be better. We can make them better. We don't have to be afraid they won't get better. We can choose to make them better by acting, whether from the margin or from the center. So, choosing action and choosing to re-envision the margin and working together is super important because the things that unite us are greater than the things that keep us apart. I truly believe that. So for full text of some of the books and essays I referenced, you can use this bibliography. And here are some of the links to learn more about what you can do from the University of Bath, the NHS, Laramani, again, highly recommended, and Culture Ally. And feel free to contact me at any of these places. Lastly, thank you to the festival organizers for allowing me here today, and thank you for listening.
Thank you so much for that really important discussion. So, any questions from our audience?
I mean, I feel like I could ask like half a dozen questions, but I'll stick to one. To what extent do you and other members of your organisation find that you have to find a person of colour within the context that you're wanting to dress as in order to justify your being there to predominantly to white people?
I think that we tend to do that because we know the question is going to come up, but we shouldn't have to do that because someone who's Irish doesn't have to do that if they want to dress like a German in history. Someone who's Polish doesn't have to do that if they want to dress like a Russian or a Spanish. Like, white people don't do that for their own country. So I think we should resist the temptation to like justify why we're there and arm ourselves with this knowledge because it shouldn't exist. We shouldn't have to do it.
It's something, I'm reenactor as well. I think it's something that we're modern people reenacting the past. So quite frankly, skin colour, religion shouldn't matter.
I agree.
I've also got like 50 million questions.
Well, okay, if we can't cover them all here, please email me.
I will
answer.
And this is kind of like a very like sort of a one of the lighter ones. But have you found much of a difference in how you're treated since Bridgerton? And like has its embracing of people of colour in that context?
Yeah, that feels really new though.
Yeah, for sure.
And since it happened during the pandemic and I wasn't like really playing, I wonder if that has changed people who do later periods. I started with 15th century Italy, then I went to 14th, a little bit of 12th, right? 16th century, so I stayed there. So Bridgerton didn't really touch that for me, but I bet people who do early 19th century, it probably did help.
I have a question about whether you notice different reactions depending on the context or type of event you're attending. So whether it's more aimed at hobbyists or whether it's more of an academic event or, you know, because there are differences, I guess, in sort of something like, what's the word? More like hobby-based Renaissance festivals versus reenacting a specific historical event, for example. I wondered how that sort of plays into...
There are different reactions in those different spheres. I've never actually been to a Renaissance festival. I keep telling myself I should go to one to see how it is. I've really only done reenactment or experimental archaeology. I will say that being told you're not where you're supposed to be happened in all of those spheres, just in different ways, right? Sometimes it's just that I've never socially hung out with a black person or a person of some other color. This makes me feel weird. And they say things that make you feel like you don't belong there. And then you don't come back. And that's why a lot of dress history organizations, even just hobby organizations, have a hard time holding on to people of color. Because who wants to spend their time and energy on the weekend to go and feel like they don't belong and be told they don't belong in not so many words?
Evelyn, and then
this may be, this isn't a frivolous question, but has Bridgerton made any difference?
we just had that question.
Oh, sorry,
I don't think it really has. I think, did you hear the pushback on Bridgerton? Like,
Yeah,
all over that it makes people uncomfortable, whether it's on TV or whether you're standing there in an 18th century dress in front of them.
I mean, you could apply this question to any academic discipline probably, but do you think there's something systemic about dress history as a discipline and the way it's taught as well, which, I mean, I was talking to a student the other day which is saying, you know, in your courses, are you teaching globalized dress history, or the fact that it comes from this very like Eurocentric context as a discipline to start with, whether that has an impact as well, and whether we need to think in a more systemic level about changing the discipline and the way that it's...
I think that is happening, actually. I think there's been like a shift away from like the great man theory in a lot of different disciplines of talking about what these men told us about history and believing every word they said, and making those changes. As someone who is the age of a lot of professors now, I think if I was a professor, I would actively add more information into my curriculum to address questions like this, to not eliminate, but to minimize the bias that I'm presenting to my students. And I think students now are also questioning these things when they show up in class. So they're helping the professors along this journey. And it takes a long time to turn a big ship. But I think if professors and students both do their part, then what you're talking about is actually going to happen. And it is happening, I think, now.
So just a quick continuing on from there. The Society of Antiquaries, who do the Joan Talbot Awards each year, they are now specifically aiming to decolonialise and move away from Western in their costume awards.
That's awesome. Because people all over the world wore clothes.
Yeah.
I promise you did.
No, and at the moment, I mean, dress history is quite Western in a way, which is why it's always nice to know what's going on in other places. And I think dress history is sort of, you know, it's taken a while to even be recognised as a legitimate field of study. So it's sort of slowly, you know, growing. Yeah. Perhaps feelers. So yeah. Thank you so much for your talk. Thank you, everybody. So we're a bit early, which is great. We can get to the food first. We have lunch now from 1:30 until 2:30. At 2:30, we'll have our other keynote. We will remind you about this at the end, but we'll be giving our keynote. And then this afternoon, we have our demonstrations. So our sort of next parallel session will be tomorrow.
Is the keynote back at class?
Yes. So the keynote is always in that room that we were in this morning. But we will direct people, and if anyone has any questions, please feel free to ask people.
And one more announcement, if you are part of the lucky few who've signed up to work with Rajesh, it will be back in here at past. For those of you who don't know what I'm talking about, I'm very sorry, it is full. Don't ask. Don't ask.
Yeah, so that was for the workshop, and then this morning, because we were waiting, Gigi hadn't confirmed yet, so it was a bit of a final. But if you would like to go,